Come on. Hurry up.
We're lost contact with it. Can't be far. Careful.
Come on, hurry up.
Watch it.
Oh, you've got to be kidding me.
Avenger sighted. Go. Life-born detected. Go.
Come on.
Hold your fire. We gotta bring her in.
Yes!
Hey! Cut her off! She's running! Don't let her away! Stop moving or we will shoot! Stop running! She's getting away! Go! Engaging non-lethal bars.
You're too fast, Tin Man!
Zaraiah! What are you doing coming back here? Are you crazy? They took Noah to Alcazar last night. Soon there's not gonna be anyone left to save.
I know. I'm just cutting through. I need to get to my droid.
Oh, you got it.
Oh, I got it. A couple more days and I'll be on the other side of the wall. And when the world finds out what's happening here, I'll be back to save you all. Just stay strong.
Hey. Your father would be so proud. You can sneak out behind the fence by Unit 2-5, Petrov's place. On the corner. Just watch out for Tin Men.
Reminder, preparation is a civil violation. Unlawful reproduction is a blatant neglect of our communal prosperity.
Commander requested wellness check at 1600. Please prepare your protocol.
Your drive is a pleasure. Please remain in your home.
Kick it down! Wellness check. Open the door. Keep your head down, Susan. We the breeders struggle the most, eh? now putting this one down?
No, he's going to Alcazar. The commander's getting desperate. Fucking psycho thinks more subjects will help people in on this place.
Any idea what they do up there?
Nuclear shit. You think they tell me anything?
Hopefully another break.
Hey! Ooh, dogs off the leash! We got a live one!
You think he's dead?
Must have forgot to switch this thing back to human. Looks like I'll need your help after all. Let's get the cleanup team before the commander finds out.
Not the fucking cleaners.
Please follow all regulations. Exclusion zone guidelines are in place for your
Keep moving, citizen. 100 meters.
You heard the man. Checkpoint's just ahead. No need to run. You still have a few more hours before we close up for the night.
Son of a crumpet.
Yeah, they rejected my application again. Fuck. Yeah, Commander's been on my ass. I gotta actually do watch tonight. Identification.
Zaraiah Shiab, Unit 77.
And status.
Second level exposure, 21 years.
And what exactly is your purpose for leaving the zone today?
Trapping and provisions.
Are you bringing anything else with you?
Just a few snares and some water. I'll be back before curfew.
Go ahead.
Reception detected. Step this way, citizen.
But they just let me through!
You have 3 seconds to comply. Surrender the containment unit.
Well, well, well. What have we here? Oh, packing some heavy firepower for hunting rabbits. Oh! Who did you steal this from? You know, maybe it's time to take a little trip up to Alcazar. Yeah, get some sense knocked into you. You look like you need it. Because you need to learn there are consequences for your actions.
Hey!
Whoa, whoa, whoa! Yeah, what are you doing? Drop the contraband!
Put it down!
Hostile detected. Drop the weapon.
Careful. I got nothing to lose. I'll take you all down with me.
Easy. Easy.
Hello? What the hell is going on down there, Ryman? Yeah, we have a problem here.
Relax, okay?
Look, I just need this.
You're insane. You can't think you'll make it out of here alive.
Oh, I'm getting out of here. And when I do, you'll all be sorry.
Okay. Let's just talk about this for a second, okay?
Grenade.
Yeah, it's getting out of hand.
So shoot her.
Are you sure you want me to do that? I cannot do that without any collateral damage.
I don't need to remind you what happens if there's an escape. Just get it done.
Look, I don't want anyone to die. Just let me leave and I'll put the pin back in.
Don't do anything stupid. Just put it back slowly. Shit!
Greetings, Zaraiah.
It worked.
It has been 4,563.2 days since you last activated me.
I've missed you.
Your physical data has changed significantly. I estimate 56 days until your demise.
You always were a charmer. But listen, I need you to do what you were created for. We're gonna shoot our way out of here. Take this. This is gene lock, but you can use it. It looks like they've already deployed more troops. If we hurry, we can still make it before the lockdown. What are you waiting for? Arm it.
I regret to inform you that I am programmed for companionship, not for violence.
You've got to be kidding me. We don't have time for this.
I am not kidding. My humor module has been badly damaged. Your father, in his brilliance, created me with a strict no aggression axiom.
No, this can't be happening.
My sympathy centers are detecting anger.
Of course I'm angry! All those years? The reactor, you saved my life! What's the point in all of this if you can't help me?
My primary mandate is to protect you, Zaraiah. But if Exodus is what you desire, a violent intervention may not be the only way.
So, what are you supposed to do then?
Any security data that I have is long outdated, but it is possible that one of the older border outposts may still be on the analog system.
Analog?
Manual gate controls requiring physical passcodes. I suppose I could attempt a few I have rattling around in my spare partition.
Do you really think it'll work?
I would state the probability of survival. But my companionship protocols simply suggest that we hope for the best.
An irradiated orphan and a pacifist war droid. All the odds against us. What could go wrong?
That's it. Outpost 1.
Whoa. Look at this.
Left over from just after the incident.
All this time, I can't believe they've just kept us here.
Wait!
That must be the gate. Do your thing.
Doing my thing. It's working.
What's happening? They're coming! Try again! No!
Check your weapons. She must be here.
No. Come on.
Ah, there she is. Weapons free, soldier. Fire at will. Go.
You go first. I'll be right behind you. Zaraiah, you must run.
No, I'm not leaving you.
I have fulfilled my primary mandate, but there is still hope for you.
No, I can't.
Run, and do not turn back.
Yeah. She just came in and put it on my desk. Some sort of droid software. Apparently they've been trapped there since the incident. It's time. Mobilize the team. We're going in. So what do you think? Will you help us?
I guess you could say it's my primary mandate.
Please follow all protection rules.
I don't know how she managed to get the gate open.
Exclusion zone guidelines are in place for your safety.
She had an old model droid with her, but
Possession of contraband is punishable by termination.
Ivan's team destroyed it before it got out. Pretty much just crushed it under the gate.
Wall breach.
Yeah, the original one, yeah.
Anomaly detected.
No, just the girl.
Exclusion zone, sector 12. Reminder. Procreation is a civil violation.
No, we'll be taking it from here. No problem, Commander. Just gotta get this gate open. Yeah, excavator's on its way. Should be here any minute. Yeah.
Unlawful reproduction